Still waiting. Oh, something's happening. Okay. Are we good? You guys good back there? I think we're rolling now. Okay. Yeah, let me say something. Check 1, 2. We're good? Okay, you guys can hear me over there? All right. So I think we're gonna get started. Not too bad. What, 32 minutes late? Nice. So many apologies. I was out for a bite, and Comic-Con out here I think slowed us down, a little busier than normal. So, all right, my name's Toran, and we're gonna talk about identity maps today and what that does for you. The talk is certainly not intended to offend anyone who works on Ember data. It's not necessarily meant to replace Ember data. It's also not meant to replace Ember model or anything Eric Brin is working on, so he won't troll me here on Twitter. But the idea is that if you're using any of these projects or you're doing persistence yourself, there's some magic in there today. And ultimately, I hope to demystify some of that a little bit. The talk itself isn't too terribly intense. What I like to tell people is when I give talks, it's a little bit of the content. But when I was younger, I got a lot more out of watching someone else build something than I did the content they were trying to show off. So there's going to be a little bit of the identity map stuff, certainly, but also the way that I work, the way I think, those sort of things are going to come across, and they're a big value add, I think, if you're hanging out or if you're here online watching. So I'm going to do first is kind of show this application I built for Ember Conf, and I showed it off. It's kind of a really simple Kanban app that lets you add items from the left. From this unassigned group to this assigned column. Really basic Ember app. And during the talk, I had this moment where you actually drill down and select one of the items on the right, and it opens up kind of a detail view. And during the talk, I actually had, it was a little bit more magical than this, where it actually would kind of auto-pop the to-do item in here, and if you typed into the project, you would actually get sort of a data-bound attribute that would match whatever item you clicked on, and that would change just like the URL is changing as we kind of skip around here, which is kind of cool. Now this doesn't work, which is kind of sad, but I actually did that on purpose just to kind of show in a real application, eventually there becomes a problem if your application gets a little bigger where you're touching the DOM several different places or you've data bound the DOM in several places, and ideally you'd like to have it be one JavaScript object that's being updated. So you don't have to manage different JavaScript objects per view. And if you're new to JavaScript, we did this in the old days very painfully in jQuery, where you would have one DOM node and it would actually have like the name first. And I would have to keep that DOM node in sync with the one in the detail view that I'm typing into. So over time, it was just that duplication that kind of rotted your code base. And the same thing can happen still in Ember. The trick that we're going to show here in just a second is it's actually pretty easy to use the same pointer or the same JavaScript object in memory so that when I click on first, that I actually get this first. I notice here it's really small on the bottom, so, but I should be able to get the same pointer so that when I do change this, it changes the same JavaScript object in memory, and I'm not having to manage the DOM twice or even manage two different JavaScript objects or collections. So how does this work? We're gonna look at the final application for a minute and kind of show off the change that we're gonna make here. And let's go to demo. There's actually a route here, which is the child route. And child route right now just console logs the parameters that the router dumps out for me. And I probably should have done a little show of hands, but now the internet's involved and who knows what's gonna happen. But show of hands locally here. I mean, are a lot of people very new to Ember, like the first month? A couple of people, okay, cool. I don't want to skip over too much, but I don't want everybody else to be super bored. But I'll give you the really quick tour here that I have two routes in Ember. I have this parent route, which is all of the to-dos, and that's this guy right here. Whoops, this guy. And then underneath of that, I actually have a child route. And notice on the end, there's something special about the child route and that is starts with this colon syntax, where I do colon to do underscore ID. And the reason I call this out is this is sort of how Ember is going to map over the ID from the URL. So if I flip back to Chrome here real quick, the URL, if you didn't notice earlier, is actually changing anytime I click one of these to-dos. So right now it's to do 4. If I change it here, it becomes to do 1, 2, and so on. In the Ember app, I need to be able to look up that JavaScript object by its primary value somehow. And Ember kind of takes care of the heavy lifting there. And we won't go too deep into this as like a low-level Ember tutorial. But I call out the colon to do underscore ID because all I get in this particular route hook is a params object. And then what I did in the browser, say I didn't know what I was doing right now, is I just console logged out params. And if we flip back, you can kind of see over here on the right, anytime I changed, I was getting an actual object that was console logged out, which was to do 1, to do 2. So the thing to call out is there's a key called to do underscore ID. So if I wanted to look this up somewhere, I would use this to do underscore ID value. And let's pretend I have this magical cache of objects. And so if the word identity map is new, all it means in my mind is just a cache of objects. So we're going to have a place to go look objects up by a primary key. And if you're an old school programmer, it's just a dictionary. We have a key that looks up a value, very basic stuff. How do we get this magical dictionary? For right now, because I want to keep a little bit of the magic hidden so you guys don't leave after you finish that first beer, is we're just going to show the final version, and then I'm going to show from the parent route how this all hooks up at the very end. So first I'm going to say this.getStore, which is just some magical cache. And then what I'm actually going to return here is store.find for a particular type, which is the first part of that dictionary lookup. And then if I do params.to underscore ID, I get the second part, which is that it's kind of a two-dimensional like array where I have a type and an ID that identifies an individual value. So if I return the JavaScript object that comes out of the cache, what happens to the front end? So you'll notice already I have a bound object here. And if I click first, it will change first. If I click last, it will change. But even better, when I start typing, because I have the same pointer in memory, it just updates the exact same record. I don't have to manage that at all. So why is that important? Just over time, again, the bigger the application gets, the more pain you're going to have managing this stuff. So I'm not going to spend a lot of the talk. In fact, none of the talk is going to be going into this application. If you want to check this out, it's on EmberConf. It's called Test-Driven Development by Example, I think. It actually builds this entire app. If you're really new to Ember and you're just like, oh, I haven't seen a really good tutorial, this EmberConf talk I gave was like 30 minutes, and I built this app test first. It was kind of a fun app. What we're going to do instead is really focus in on this cache or this identity map concept and just build it from scratch. So the first thing we're going to do is basically jump into an empty repository and start out with just a really basic test. And what we're going to do is just incrementally add features to this cache until we have it at feature parity with what you just saw me use in the real app. And then we'll take 1 second look at the final app when we're done and just show how it all works between parent and child. So the first thing we're going to do is touch is just a way to create a new file, basically. So I'm going to create a new unit test called store test. And I'm going to open this up, so store test. And if you're unfamiliar with QUnit, we're going to be using that. So the first thing we're going to do is actually import test and module from QUnit. If you don't like QUnit, I'm sorry. It's just what comes with Ember out of the box. So if you like Mocha and Jasmine and you're new tonight, you don't have to use QUnit, of course. You can pick up an add-on and use Mocha or something else. QUnit has this kind of fun module syntax, and for now we're just going to namespace it basically and say store unit tests. And then we're going to write our first test. And ideally, the simplest test for me right now is that we can push an item in and it adds it to the cache. Basically, the start of this whole thing. So we'll say push will add item to the store. And just like, and actually I should say, even if you don't know Ember, you just know some JavaScript, this dirty little secret about this talk is everything I'm going to show you is vanilla JavaScript except about 2 pieces. It gets a lot more complicated if you want to dive into the Ember side, but I tried to put this talk together so it's accessible for younger JavaScript programmers that just know a little bit of vanilla JavaScript, but it's also appealing conceptually, or the technique is to older Ember programmers that, or maybe how does Ember data work if they know that library. So the first thing, if you're regular JavaScript programmers, we're just going to new up a store object, and then we're going to say store.push. The only trick to this is this key value dictionary has to be unique. So I've got to have a primary key or an index ID value for every single thing I push in here. So I'm going to start out with an ID of 1 and just a really basic name like Toran. Next, we'll actually go get this person object is what I'll call it for now. And we're going to do a get by ID. and we'll actually just pass in the ID. And then we'll just do a really simple assert where we're gonna say person.id is a 1, and then person.name is Toran, something fun like that. And I'm going to use Ember CLI. If you're not familiar with that, it's just a command line runner that gives you a really great build tool, testing tools, all for free. You don't have to write your own grunt, gulp, whatever's next. It's just managed and built and maintained sort of by the Ember community. So it's a great thing. If you haven't heard of Ember CLI, Stefan Penner kind of came up with the idea, I think, about a year or two ago now. And it's been really refined. We're using it at work. I've been using it for about 6 or 8 months now professionally, and it's just that sense. I'm not having to manage a bunch of NPM dependencies myself anymore. The whole community bears that burden, for better or worse. So what we're going to do from the command line, if you're not sure what Ember looks like, is we can basically do Ember test-server, and we'll run all the tests as well as JS hint. So your linting stuff is built in, and then it just tells us if something fails and keeps a runner that's sort of watching. If you're a Ruby developer and you've used Guard or something that will watch your tests and rerun them with every change, this is the same idea. Now, the first failure that we actually get down here at the bottom is that the store itself is not defined, which makes total sense. The older JavaScript programmer means like, why not? It's probably just a global. Well, we're going to use the new ES6 stuff here for this test. Ember CLI makes that really easy. If you're not sure what ES6 is, it's basically just a way to do AMD, required.js, common.js modules, but it's built in or soon to be built into the browser. So we're going to use ES6 here just to make everything easier, and we're going to import store from JS store. Now, this won't happen for free. I've actually got to go up and actually add. Right now, there's nothing in the add-on, so I'm actually going to add this store.js file. And this is an Ember talk, so I can kind of gloss over, but for the most part, we're going to actually use Ember to be our base object. And all we're going to produce in this talk is a really simple cache that is sort of managed by one object. Ember just makes that easy, so I'm actually going to import Ember from Ember. Then I'll actually create the store object. It's just going to be an Ember object extend. And if you're just a vanilla JavaScript programmer here to hang out, Ember object extend basically just wraps a really basic iffy or a immediately invoked function and has a constructor function built in, so you don't have to write that. So we're going to do a export default store here. And first thing I'm going to do is actually flip back to the test runner to see what happened. And whoops, can't find variable store here. Export default store. So I probably broke this guy. Oh, import. That was my boss calling me out over there. No, I'd actually import. We hire him. Peace. All right. So the syntax does matter. So you have to do import from. Classic test-driven development where I'm writing a test, the test is failing. One thing I want to call out that's, I think, a myth in the test-driven community is that you have to somehow magically get the test to pass every time. And you'll notice, I think I'm a little better shape than I was. Maybe it was kind of busted up a bit earlier. But I still have a failure after I made this first change. And I think one thing, if you get anything out of this talk, is test-driven development is not the silver bullet. It's not necessarily just a regression tool. I try to teach or mentor that it's actually a really cool feedback tool. It's a really great feedback tool. In this case here, I'm just learning about the error message as I go. And as long as I get a different error message with each change, of course, I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. And this one is actually telling me that store.push is undefined. It's kind of undefined is way on the right here because my monitor is a little bigger. But basically what it says is the obvious, that if I'm going to use push right here, I probably better have a push function declared. So we're going to say push is a function. And to bore you guys and gals, I'll go ahead and do get by ID as well, just because we're going to have both of those required. And I'm doing that because I want to kind of skip to the main problem here, which is, of course, we don't have a person at all. So what it's kind of word wrapped horribly here is that person.id is undefined because I'm not returning anything from get by ID. So explicitly, I'm just getting an undefined value. Now, what I need to do is make this work. The simplest version of this is I just want a dictionary in JavaScript. So I'm going to create an init function that's basically a constructor function. And I'm going to create something called identity map. And it's going to be just an object literal or an object in JavaScript. And all I'm going to do in the push is say identity map. And if I actually take data in here, I'll say data is equal to the data. Whatever object and properties you pass in are going to be available on the dictionary. So in the get by ID, if I just say have in the running application, now we have a passing build. So there's a green build. And honestly, it's nothing magical. We're basically just using the JavaScript object literal to store a key that maps to a value like I mentioned earlier. So we'll just kind of keep iterating here. And the next test is really that push should also return the created object. That's just something a lot of these identity maps, I think Ember Data still does this as well. So I'm just basically gonna say person is right away, so I don't have to explicitly call out and do a get by ID. And in the same situation, I should get a 1 and I should get name. But unfortunately that blows up because undefined is coming out right now. So let's flip back, and all we're gonna do, because we've already written this, is just call our own method with data.id for the moment. We'll kind of factor this as we go. So I get a passing build. Now before we actually write the next test, one thing I want to call out is we are going to do a couple Ember specific things. Obviously, we're at the Ember meetup here. And one of the things I already don't like is this isn't really an observable object. So you'll notice in my asserts, I'm not using getters like you would normally with Ember. I'm just saying .id, kind of vanilla JavaScript. Ideally, and as we progress, we're going to actually create a rich Ember object that's observable. So let's go back and just sort of modify this first test. And let's say that I actually expect to do Ember.getID and then Ember.getName. And that should fail just because it's not an observable object, so I actually get undefined right now. The fix for this is we actually just need to make an Ember object. And if you haven't seen this yet, it's as simple as ember.object.create, and then you slam in the data. So that's our record, right? And then instead of data being a primitive JavaScript object, it's now sort of just an observable object by doing Ember object create. So if we do that, we should get a green build, and we do. So we'll flip back to the bottom test, and we should have the same assertion there as well. I'm just gonna copy paste this so I don't have to struggle through that again. And we should get the same build, which we do. So we have 9 tests, and they're all good. Next, we're gonna do a push should update an existing object. And so what we'll do is we could probably create record first. We'll call it first. And we'll do store create. The important part of the setup for this test is I want to use the same ID, because in reality, if I get a new payload and I want to sort of update this cache or this store, I'd like to just push that same object literal and just have it reflect with the same ID. I don't really want 2 objects. That's the whole point, is I want a single object in memory. So I'm going to just update the name basically, and we'll see if that works. So we'll come down here, and I don't really care so much with the IDs here. More or less, I just want to assert that first and updated. And updated actually should have a new value called updated, and first should have the original name Toran to start. Let's just see if that test is good to get rolling here, and it is. So the failing test is everything works fine, of course, if you run these in order, because these are kind of happening top down. But what if I take this assertion, what if I take this assertion down here and just say first name is also updated? Because it's the same pointer, right? Uh-oh. Wasn't updated. So we haven't implemented this yet. It's a failing test on purpose, just to kind of drive out the very next small feature. And in Ember, this is kind of cool actually. You don't have to roll over the keys yourself manually. So I can just say record is, try and go find it. If the record exists, great. We're just going to update it, so we can do record.setProperties and just shove in that new object literal. Else, we're just going to bring this up and whoops, just kill that bar here. And then at the very end, just to make the original test pass that says you got to return the record, we'll still return the record. But the magic for this property is that we're going to call set properties, which is just going to basically slam that in and update the object so we get a new value. Now if we flip back, we get a passing build. Cool. Let's see, next thing is we actually need to be able to respect kind of different types of objects. So the first thing is that we have an ID that uniquely identifies us, but now we want to say like push will respect different types of model objects. And so we'll actually push in 2 different objects here. We're going to do let's do a person for this first one. And the second one will actually do something like, I don't know, I used cat. I hope no one's offended by that, which is totally cool. And so we're going to have person and cat, and that should probably update these to be person and cat. So we're going to do name, and then the name in this one should be Toran. The important part here is the IDs should be the same, but the names should be different. So we can actually assert that you can have in this cache of objects person and cats both with an ID of 1, and it doesn't override the other one, because right now this of course is not in. So we'll actually rename this to Wat. That's just a good cat name. And we'll have person here for Toran. So we should be able to come in. Let me update this guy. So we have Wat and Toran. And of course, right now, actually, the problem is I haven't gone to fetch those. So I'm going to actually just do a really quick var person equals store.find by ID. And let's get by ID, I think it is. And of course, passing in, whoops, get by ID is changed as well. Signature. And we're also going to do cat, get by ID. So we'll say cat. And just one thing I want to call out, like when you're actually breaking the API a lot of times, in this case, I've modified both the push API by adding a first parameter, as well as I'm going to be breaking the API for get by ID by adding a first parameter. All the tests above are going to be really noisy if they're running in addition. So I'm just going to comment those out for just a minute. We'll get this test passing. And this test should blow up originally. And it's kind of blowing up for a funny error. If you're seeing it down on the very bottom here, it actually says Ember object create only accepts objects. So what's funny about that is that's the first time you're running that, you're probably like, what is happening? But all that's happening is we do a create object here. And instead of it actually being data, we know it's a string now. So it's just giving us a valid complaint that, hey, you probably changed the parameter. So I'm going to actually plug in type here, as well as we change the signature for this. And now we have Toran and Wat, so we're still not passing. You notice I'm just getting a different bit of feedback here. I'm a little bit closer. The real issue here is that identity map right now is sort of a one-dimensional thing. I can only pass an ID and silo it away. What I need is to first silo away the identity map by type. So I'm going to create this object called typed identity map. Oops. And this is going to be nothing more than identity map for the given type. And if that doesn't exist, we'll just default it to kind of a default list like we do in the constructor. Next, we'll say this dot identity map for type is the typed identity map, just to kind of set that up. And then finally, we don't touch identity map by itself anymore. We touch the typed identity map. So we're going to modify the typed identity map, which is already sort of namespace one dimension, and then shove in a primary key or ID value as the second dimension. Now, this won't work by itself, so we have to copy paste this. Bear with me. If you're really sad, we're going to get here, we'll clean it up. And then finally, yep, we have to modify this to be returning a typed identity map by ID. So let's see if I get this passing here, and we're good. So first thing I want to do is, as you refactor, sometimes it gets, you get really excited. And you're like, oh, these tests are just going to pass. Toran wrote this, of course. So just plug in person, I think. And what did he have down here? Person, that sounds good. This test is probably golden. Well, the problem is Toran makes mistakes, just like everybody else. So I made this mistake on purpose. I don't know if anyone caught it. If you did, thanks for not calling me out. The actual mistake is back here, I actually didn't do a get by ID with the type. But our first test that we just had a minute ago was passing. So I call this out because these tests, although they're great for feedback now, they're also great for feedback later. So we're basically picking up a valid regression here if I didn't have a test for this. So keep rolling, now we're good. Switch back and again, kind of one at a time, just bring these tests back because they all need to have an updated API. So that one, just kind of flipping between to make sure the tests are still passing here. And let's see, push for person again, and get by ID got updated here as well. There we go. So we have a passing build, and that's the top of the test stack. So we're rocking away here. Next thing we're going to do is, that's great that it respects a person and a cat type, but truthfully, in a real application, you're going to need a rich model object of some kind that has special attributes about your domain or maybe some dirty tracking or something. So the next test is really that we actually get an instance of that. So we'll say push will respect, or push will add rich data model for the given type. Okay. And we'll basically push the person in here. We'll go get that person by ID. And then all I actually care about in this particular instance is that person is an instance of get it. Should get another error here that just says no. This is actually a fault of mine. So if you ever use assert equal, make sure you either put a true in here or you switch it to an OK. I actually don't mind assert equal with a true, but I don't want to start a Vim Emacs debate either. So go back to expect down here. Great feedback here, just like expected true. Well, what was it? I don't know what the actual value was. It just says it was supposed to be true. I think you learn over time that this is actually saying true is not undefined. So I got an undefined value, either phantom or testum, didn't pop that or bubble that up here. So if you're kind of curious like what that's all about, we just have not true basically for all intensive purposes. So how do we get this? How do we get this instance of? This is another Ember specific piece, but again, we're at the Ember meetup, so let's check this out. Let's talk about the line that needs to change in here. So right now I've got this record is Ember object create. I just said that I don't want to do that, and in reality I want something like this. I want person.create. But I want person.create to be dynamic because I don't want to import person, import cat, import everything I add, every model. So how do we get this to be dynamic? So here's how we do it. We're going to create sort of a way to look up. We're going to create a factory class or a local variable to look these up. We'll call it factory. And we can do this inside Ember by tapping into his dependency injection container. So if you're unfamiliar with Ember, basically the internals now give you sort of a hook back to the dependency management, which is again just a big dictionary, if that word's confusing. It says, let me look up this key, give me that object type. That's all we're gonna do is say, I want to look up a particular type with this container. And the method to do that is look up factory. And I'm gonna say model person. Now all that's gonna do is produce dynamically person. So now I can actually say record equals factory, which think of it dynamically as person.create data. So that's all we're gonna do. Now there's a little bit of a problem here, and that is we get undefined. So at the very bottom down in here, we get, hey, I tried to look up this container factory, look up factory, and something's undefined in there. Well, unfortunately, the real issue is if we go back to our test and we look at how I got an instance or an object created for store in the first place, I just actually said new store. Well, new store doesn't know anything about Ember, really. It's not very Ember specific. It just invokes a constructor function on that JavaScript object. So how in the world was I expecting to have this magic dependency injection hookup for me? It just won't work this way. So what we're gonna have to do is just subtly add the bare minimum here. And if you haven't seen this, it might go a little bit over, but I'll try and break it down one step at a time. So the first step is I'm gonna need a hook to the registry, which is really just a way to register the dictionary, the key and the value. So I'm gonna say var registry equals new ember.registry. And now registry gives me this neat register method that lets me register a key and a value. So I can say model person is person. Awesome. I also need to register this store object itself because I'm going to use the container to return an instance. So no longer am I going to do store equals new store. I'm actually going to do store equals container dot lookup store main, and that's going to actually do the newing up for me. So to do that, or to have the new up magically work, I have to register that class first. So I'm going to do register store.main. And the last missing piece is where's this magical container, the local variable for container lookup? Where is that? You haven't created it. So I can create container here by saying registry.container. So this is kind of our new process. It's obviously a bit verbose, but it's because we're going to start tapping into the dependency injection system inside of Ember. So I've got my model :person. You see this copy paste error already. That's supposed to be store. So we're going to register the store, register the person, then the container can provide me an instance by doing a lookup for store main. So let's see how far that gets us. So we have evaluating this container lookup factor is still not good, and that's probably because the tests above are getting a little bit noisy. So I've completely flipped this test, sort of the test fixture upside down. So we need to come over and comment those out. We're gonna take this up to a setup method, you can imagine, so we can refactor this out. But right now, the important part is I've got the basic functionality passing. So before we completely refactor the test, I actually want to do a final test, which is that I can register more than one object, which is kind of the intent here. So I have a person and a cat, and I'm going to register the person and the cat. So if I need to push that in, I'm going to grab all these same lines here and say push in a cat, same ID, and then we'll actually person is cat, so I'll replace, and then I should do the same thing on this. messed me up there. And again, I want this to be an instance of cat. Now that should actually fail, which it does. And if we haven't been back in the production code for a minute, so here's what you missed, is back here I hard-coded something on purpose, not to try and trick anyone, but because it was the simplest thing to get the test passing. Don't get too dynamic at first, reduce the scope or the risk as we get these tests passing. So now that I have everything plugged in, whoops, I'm actually going to say instead, I know I have the type, so I'm just gonna say dynamically plug in type. Now let's be honest, this is a little bit naive. Somebody can pass in a null, an empty string, all that good stuff. We're not gonna get too edge casey here, but for now, if we dynamically look that up by model:type, get rid of these extra lookups here, we should get that test passing, and we do. Now that that test is passing, we just need to figure out a way to take all of this noise to setup, because this test is gonna be almost unreadable. There's so much setup now. So in QUnit, you can come to the top here and just do a before each. And we'll just plug this stuff in. I'm actually gonna take cat and person up to the top because they don't actually change. So depending on your religion about variables here, I'm just gonna make them a constant. And also I'm gonna touch registry, store, and container between every test because I wanna set them up, and then I wanna set them to null or tear them down. So I'm gonna set up store, container, and registry up here, which means I need to get rid of the vars that were down here. And then finally, I need to do an after each, which is really just tear down if you haven't seen QUnit yet. And then all I'm gonna do here is set store, container, and what is it, registry to null. Now, before I touch any of the other tests, it's important to note I'm basically just getting this test passing first with this change, because one of the things about test refactoring is nobody's got your back. So you've got to be extra careful in these tests. Otherwise, you may catch yourself either completely breaking and not knowing what you did, or you actually get a false positive and the test just keeps rolling. So in this case, I just wanted to do a small step. Now what I can do is each individual test that I bring back, I can get rid of this line where I was newing up the store manually, because that just won't work anymore. So I'll run the first test just to be a little confident. And then because you guys are looking a little glazed over, I'll jump down here and just comment out the rest of them and kill the new store. And there we go, we have all 12 tests passing now. So we haven't broken anything. And also it's kind of important to note that we basically have not just different types of models and models namespaced out by ID, but we can also get rich instances. So if you want to add instance methods to these classes, you have access to do that now. It's actually producing real model objects. So that's a win. We're not done, obviously. So let's do something like find will return array of models for given type. I'm going to single ticks. You'll have to forgive me. My team currently is helping me through this tough time going from double ticks to single ticks in here. Okay, so we're going to do a store.push, and we'll do a store push person here. And we're just going to do an ID 1 again, a name of Toran. And I'm just going to do probably 2 of these to start. The important part to note for the test setup is, of course, if I expect to be able to find multiples, notice that the ID here must be different. Otherwise, I'm just going to end up trolling myself. So I'll put my buddy's name Brandon in here. And if we want to actually go find this, we have to say store.find, and then we're going to give it a particular type of object. So we'll say var all equals, oops, and the assertion we'll do here, the assert.equal is all.length is 2. And of course, the first failure we get is actually that find just doesn't exist. So we just need to flip back here and do a find method. So I'll add this to the bottom here. Whoops, oh, I always do that. Man, it's like the worst. Here we go. So now what we're gonna do is, to get us started, I can actually just get by doing the simplest thing here and just say, you know what, just return this array thing. And then we'll duplicate the data structure here by saying array. Just duplicate it for now. The trick to get this passing is, again, we're going to almost duplicate the data structure here. So we'll say this.array.push is a record. So we're going to push it in. And then for people who are using the find API, they're going to get the array out. And we get a passing build. Now, if anybody was watching, I was trying to be a little sneaky here. Basically, I did this on purpose where I pushed in the type information. But if I push in a different type and I put cat here, I still expect there to be 2, correct? Because I passed into the API the person. I do not expect to find any of this other type, and that should fail us and give us a place to get started. So at the bottom, finally, I get some decent feedback that expected 2 is not 3. What that means is, of course, it picked up everything in the array because we were coding it very simply that way. So the first thing we need to do is just modify the way we've done this, sort of in the same vein as we did earlier. So we're going to create a typed array, and this is just going to be none other than this.array for a type or an empty array to get started. Then we'll say this.array for type equals typed array. Whoops, oh, God, you scumbag. All right, so sorry. So we'll do typed array, and finally we'll return the typed array for that type, obviously. So now we'll take this up to the push, and we're gonna basically do the same code here. Now, forgive me, there's some duplicate data structure and some duplicate code. We're gonna tighten this up in just a few minutes. So we have typed array, and instead of just pushing into array, we're gonna actually push into typed array. Whoops, and of course the big trick is I left type out of this. I left out the parameter for type earlier so that it wouldn't give us a JS hint error. So I have to add that now. We're actually going to use it. And of course, we get a passing build. Is this thing on? Okay, they're all passing. So everything's good. One of the things that might be up for debate, if my buddy Stefan was here, he might tell me the performance implications. So bear with me if there actually is a performance implication of looking an ID up off the array. You might not want to do this, but I thought it'd be a fun exercise to do, which is how do we refactor this stuff? We have some tests. Does that give us some confidence? So even if you don't agree with the low-level computer science of what I'm about to do, let's just have some fun. We'll tear it down to 1 and show how I reduce this duplication. So first of all, identity map now is not going to suffice. So let's basically find identity map and get rid of all the typed identity map mess. And so we have another one down here, and I think that's it. So the last step is we're going to have to implement sort of a simple array filter here. So in the get by ID, we'll basically return the typed array filter, get a model in there, and we're going to return the 0. This is what I mean by a performance hit here, is I'm actually going to start filtering by enumerating the array. You may not want to do that if a key-based lookup is faster. So here we go. We're going to return in the filter that model.get ID is equal to the ID passed in. If it is, great, we've got a match, and then we'll just return the 0th item in that array. All the test. That was kind of fun. What else do we have that we can kill in here? So I've got this array, but I still have some duplication here. So I have the typed array about 1 billion times. Let's take that up to the top, and we can kind of actually make this a private function. Again, up for debate if this is the best practice, but nobody needs access to this. This is a completely private method, and now we have modules. We can actually hide that from anyone who's consuming this API. So I'm going to create this thing called typed array. It's going to be a function, and it's going to take the type and the store. So basically, we'll get an instance to the store object, and we'll basically bounce this back, and all we're going to return in here is the typed array. And instead of this, I'm actually going to optionally sub in the store. So basically get the store for the type and then return the array. So it becomes a little bit of a helper to reduce this duplication. So we go back down here. I should be able to do what? Typed array, passing in the type and this, and do a push for record, I think it is. Yep. And then down here, and actually let's do some saves in between here just to make sure we don't screw anything up. And next, I'll noise and do a typed array for type and this dot filter, and we're good. And then finally, get rid of the super big duplication and literally just return typed array for type using the store. So the goal was, and in fact, my font is such that I can pretty much get the entire identity map in one screen slide. So the idea here is really to show there's no magic at all. It's just a dictionary. That's it. So that's the gist. All the tests are passing. We're pretty close to being done here. There's one kind of nice thing, and it's basically the get by ID. Whoops. Let me just go back to that get by ID. One of the things you noticed at the end or at the beginning is I showed the API is I actually use find to look up with an ID. And this is just a sort of legacy heritage from the Ember data days. And honestly, the way the community started out using find, where you'd have an overloaded method, meaning you could just do find for person or find for person with parameters. That could be an ID to start or a filtered function. Today, what we're going to do is just get a consistent API. So when you leave here, if you look at a find method in Ember data or just write this yourself at some point, then you know sort of the idiom is like, oh, we use find and we just overload it if I have some optional stuff. So I'm going to do a find replace it by ID. And I'm going to replace it with find. globally. So it's going to break probably every test in here, at least a few. So we have a few tests. I'm not even going to look at it because I already know the actual error. Now what I'm going to do in here is just modify find a little bit. I'm going to let get by ID sort of operate for the moment as a private API. If you want to use it, be my guest. Normally, you see kind of an underscore in Python, like a double underscore, which means like really don't do this. Maybe like, has that ever happened? I don't actually know, but I don't care actually at this point if people want to reach in for get by ID. Ideally, I'm trying to do it as a convenience method so the API reads very nicely or very fluid. So here's the idea. If I have some options here, optionally, if the type of options triple equals undefined, then I want to return the array, because undefined meaning they just asked for a type. Otherwise, I'm just going to return this.getById, and I'm going to pass in both type and options. So hopefully get those tests passing, and we do. So now what we have from the test perspective is really a public API, living documentation. I would call it like living, breathing documentation. If somebody wants to see how this code works or understand it, they can come in here and read exactly how it works, which is cool. Let's switch back to the demo app now. And I promised you sort of revealing the magic, which again, there isn't really any. And that is in the child route, I'm using find, like you can see over there. Whoops, other way. Like you can see on the right, which is, hey, I'm going to go find this particular type in the dictionary, and I expect to have an ID for that. So how do they get there in the first place? So basically all I do is, again, I get the cache, and I loop over my AJAX response. I just push them in for a given type. And this is all reflected in the test that we just went through. So this shouldn't even be magical. That's why I kind of like to wait until the end. Because at the beginning, I'm kind of showing a ton of concepts, but at the end, you actually wrote this. We wrote this together as a group. You understand, I push in an object, and then I can go find it. And then finally, at the bottom, you can see I'm overloading this find by saying, just give me all of them. Versus in the other one here, if I go and, whoops, not do that. Now you can kind of see them both side by side. Is the top one is the parent where I do find everybody, and the bottom one is I find by ID. Any questions? Yes, sir.
It's maybe way out of scope, but would it be how much more work would it be to like implement like unit work time where like you have say you put all this information in the store and then you need to like send it off to a backend database? How much more work would it be to do that backend?
I think Ember data just went 1.0. I mean, it's talking just the complexity of implementing a true sync step. I mean, honestly, it depends how far you want to go. Honestly, what I'm doing right here at the top is the most primitive, and that is I just fire off a get JSON, and I'm sort of rolling in some extent, what you're saying, which is a really basic version of that. Ember data is to the far extreme, where they want to abstract away the entire sync such that you just say save, from a model, and poof, you're done. So it depends how far you want to go. That's kind of a loaded question there. Or how much free time you have, yeah. Cool. One thing I will mention is I didn't show it here because I wanted to keep it really basic for today. But if you're ever like, well, how does Ember magically update? Like if I have an array and you returned it from this cache and then somebody pushes one in there, how does it show up in my HTML? So behind the scenes, I was using today very primitive array, just the normal JavaScript brackets. But in Ember, and if you actually look into I have like an Ember CLI simple store project or an add-on for Ember that basically is what you guys saw today. There is underneath of it this array proxy, which is a really cool way to say, you know what, if I fly through here and I still want to paint the UI so the browser draws really quickly, I can return an empty array to start, let my AJAX do its asynchronous work, and let the browser manage that. When it then pushes things into the array like it does here, just magically bind that result or those new items, and it'll show up in the HTML via data binding. You don't have to write any code to do that. It's just called an array proxy. It's one of the primitives inside of Ember itself. So it just works for free that way. And if you want to look at the internals, it's about 10 lines of code to do something like that. But it's sort of the next step. If we were to iterate from here to, all right, how do I make it, observable like Ember data or any of the other projects? So, all right. Well, if anybody has any questions, just ping me, or I'll be hanging out here the rest of the week with these guys. Thanks for coming out.